These are the most common tissues in the body. In fact, it would be very difficult to have a human body without them. They fasten superficial epithelial tissues to underlying structures. They bundle and organize muscles and nerves. They connect one part of the body to another. They are your connective tissues. In this video, we will go over the structures, locations, and functions of the connective tissues. Your objectives for this video are to, number one, explain the functions and characteristics of the connective tissues. 2, relate the structure and location of the different connective tissues to their functions. And number 3, in the lab, you should be able to identify each type of connective tissue after viewing an image or a slide. As I mentioned before, connective tissues are found throughout the human body. Their main function is to connect and bind tissues and structures. We will find connective tissues sandwiched between the layers of an organ where they connect those layers and bind them together. Connective tissues also link organs together. A second function is support. Connective tissues like bone and cartilages form the framework for the body and support its weight. For example, the pelvic bones transfer the weight of your upper body to your thigh bones, which are called femurs. The femur then transfers that weight to the major bone of your lower leg, which is called the tibia. And the tibia transfers that weight to a bone in your ankle called the talus. Your connective tissues also provide protection to your internal organs and absorb mechanical shock. For example, many bones form a cage-like structure that protects delicate organs. An example of this would be your rib cage and sternum, which protect your heart, lungs, liver, and other fleshy organs. Cartilages, like those in your knee or between the bones in your spine, absorb mechanical shocks to your body when you walk or run or jump. Many of your connective tissues also house immune system cells that spring into action and protect your body from invading microorganisms. A final function to remember is that your connective tissues, well, one in particular, are involved in transporting substances like oxygen, carbon dioxide, minerals, hormones, vitamins, and nutrients to all parts of your body. Any idea which tissue that might be? Did you say blood? If so, you are absolutely correct. Blood is the connective tissue that is involved in transport. A handy mnemonic device to remember the functions of connective tissues was provided by a student in class last semester. This device is containers and bins transport products and supplies. Do you remember what functions the red letters on this slide correspond to? The con in containers stands for connect. Bin means bind. Transport, well, obviously that's transport. Pro stands for protect, and sup stands for support. Like all tissues, human connective tissues consist of cells that are surrounded by an extracellular matrix, or ECM. This ECM consists of ground substance and embedded protein fibers. What makes this tissue different from your epithelial tissues is that the ECM is visible and can be used to distinguish between one connective tissue and another. Connective tissues are grouped into two categories that differ in the types of cells present and the components or appearance of their ECM. These categories are connective tissue proper and specialized connective tissue. Let's take a look at them individually. Connective tissue proper is also known as general connective tissue. It is often involved in connecting and binding the layers of an organ together or connecting organs together. This type of connective tissue is located throughout the body and in some cases forms the internal structure of some organs. Connective tissues are defined by their cells in ECM. There are two types of cells in these tissues, resident and migrant. Resident cells are those cells that are permanently located in the tissue, and migrant cells are those that can leave a tissue and go to another area of the body depending upon the circumstances at a given time. Fibroblasts are the most common resident cell. They are mature cells that have the properties of an immature cell, which we'll call a blast cell. Fibroblasts make protein fibers and ground substance, the components of the ECM in a connective tissue. As long as they're alive, they will continually produce collagen fibers. Adipocytes, or fat cells, are resident cells found in many different connective tissues. The cytoplasm of each cell is filled with a single large lipid inclusion, like this one. These cells provide energy storage, but may cushion an organ or a structure when they're present in large amounts. Mast cells are the largest of your resident cells. These are immune system cells that are filled with cytosolic inclusions called granules. In this picture, they are stained blue. Granules contain chemical messengers like histamine, which act on blood vessels and other cells to promote inflammation. Inflammation is a protective response that activates the immune system to heal and repair tissues or fight off invading microorganisms before they can cause an infection. Phagocytes are immune system cells. They ingest foreign substances, old organelles, microorganisms, and dead or dying cells by a process called phagocytosis. Your phagocytes include your macrophages, which are either resident or migrant cells, and neutrophils, which are migrant cells. Other immune system cells can also migrate into and out of connective tissues, depending upon a body's needs. Now let's look at the tissues. There are four basic types of connective tissue proper. They are loose connective tissue, dense connective tissue, reticular tissue, and adipose tissue. Remember, I will describe the tissue and tell you about its function and locations. You will need to be able to recognize the tissues when you see them in the lab, and you will need to remember locations and functions for the lecture portion of your class. This is loose connective tissue, aka areolar tissue. You'll know it when you see it because it consists mostly of ground substance, so all of these white spaces here represent the ground substance. And embedded within the ground substance, we're going to have three types of protein fibers. You'll have your collagen fibers, which are usually quite thick, and they look like pink strands that run through the slide. You'll have your elastic fibers, which are usually darkly stained purple, and they look like thin threads. And then you'll have reticular fibers, which are a type of collagen fiber that's highly branched. You'll also see different types of cells embedded within the ECM. You'll see fibroblasts, which are usually recognized by their roughly circular to ovoid dark purple nuclei. Occasionally you'll see adipocytes, which may look like little white circles. And then you'll see sometimes immune system cells within these slides as well. Your areolar or loose connective tissue is found beneath the epithelium of the skin and in membranes lining your body cavities. You'll also find this tissue within the walls of your hollow organs. There, it functions to support blood vessels that are vital to the avascular epithelial tissues nearby. It also helps to house immune system cells that are ready to jump into action should the tissue become infected with unwanted microorganisms. This is another figure that shows your loose or areolar connective tissue. Again, Notice how much ground substance is present here. Can you identify the fibers and the cells? This is an image from a cadaver. Here you can see the epithelial layer of the skin on top. That's this rectangle. And just deep to that, this kind of whitish layer, that is the areolar tissue, the loose connective tissue. The next tissues are called dense connective tissues or fibrous connective tissues because they consist mostly of protein fibers. These tissues are grouped into three classes. You have the dense irregular collagenous tissue, the dense regular collagenous tissue, and your dense regular elastic tissue. Let's take a look at them. Dense irregular collagenous tissue has an extracellular matrix that consists of collagen bundles arranged in three different directions. This tissue provides strength that helps the tissue resist pulling or tension in all three planes of movement. This tissue is usually found in areas where tissues get pulled in multiple directions, such as the dermis of the skin and the capsules that surround our joints. At the bottom of this slide, you can see an image of this tissue. Notice how the thick pink collagen fiber bundles swirl around in an irregular way. The swirls almost look like the waves on an angry sea of ground substance. To the left, you can see the dense irregular connective tissue just under the areolar tissue, and that is just deep to the superficial skin. This is dense regular collagenous connective tissue. Like the dense irregular, the ECM of this tissue is composed largely of thick collagen bundles that are stained pink here. But here, the collagen bundles are arranged in a parallel fashion. This provides a great amount of resistance to pulling, but only in one plane. You find this type of tissue in tendons and ligaments that are usually only pulled in one direction. Tendons are connective tissues that connect muscles to bone, and ligaments are connective tissues that mostly connect bone to bone. In the figure on the left, as muscles of the forearm contract, they pull on the tendons here. This pulls the tendons in a proximal direction towards the midline of the body. This type of movement helps to move our bones. And this is dense regular elastic tissue. Like the other two types of tissues, protein fibers are prominent in the ECM here. The dark squiggly strands that you see, like this one, are elastic fibers. They provide stretch and recoil to tissues. Mixed in with the elastic fibers are randomly oriented collagen fibers that help prevent the tissue from tearing. Notice that the cells are not prominently featured here, but they are present. This type of tissue is found in the walls of organs that must stretch to perform their function, like large blood vessels, such as the aorta, which you see here, and certain ligaments. Reticular tissue is composed of branched collagen fibers called reticular fibers. These fibers form a network that can support small structures such as blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. They are also found in lymph nodes in the spleen, where they form a web-like net that traps old and foreign cells. If you follow the dark green collagen or reticular fibers here, you can see that they branch in many directions. So it's not hard to imagine that this would form a network or a net of fibers that hold cells like this one in place. Adipose tissue consists of fat-storing adipocytes plus fibroblasts and ECM. Adipocytes can increase in size to the point where fibroblasts and ECM are scarcely visible. The functions of adipose tissue include fat storage. Adipose tissue is a major energy reserve for the body. Insulation. Adipose tissue helps us retain warmth, and shock absorption and protection. There are two types of adipose tissue, brown and white. White adipose tissue is the most common in adults and appears, well, white or yellow. White fat's primary functions are to store energy, cushion, and produce hormones that are then secreted into the bloodstream. The adipocytes of this tissue have one large lipid inclusion that can grow in size. This tissue is found deep to the skin, where it is called subcutaneous fat, but it is also found in the abdomen, the breasts, the hips, the buttocks, and the thighs. White adipose tissue that surrounds the heart and abdominal organs is called visceral fat. Visceral fat is very unhealthy. It can impair organ function and has been linked to increased insulin resistance and increased risk for heart attack and stroke. Brown fat, also called brown adipose tissue, is a special type of body fat that is activated when you get cold. Brown fat produces heat to help humans maintain their body temperature in cold conditions. It is found commonly in newborns, children, and hibernating animals. Brown fat stores decline in adults, but they still help with warmth. Research out of Harvard Medical School suggests that brown fat is more active in people in Boston in the colder months. Brown fat appears brown because it contains multiple lipid inclusions and may have many more mitochondria than does white fat. Mitochondria are the engines in brown fat that burn calories to produce heat. Brown fat has generated interest among researchers because it appears to act a lot more like muscle than fat and may be able to use regular body fat, that's the white fat, as fuel. In addition, exercise may stimulate hormones that activate brown fat. It's too soon to know whether brown fat's calorie burning properties, however, can be harnessed for weight loss. So now, let's try a few practice questions. Here's the first one. I'll read the question. Pause the video, think of your answer, and then join me when you're ready to see if you're right. Which of the following tissues is the most abundant and widely distributed? Would that be epithelial, connective, muscle, or nervous tissue? Number 2, connective tissue, is the correct answer here. Connective tissues are the most abundant throughout the body. Remember, connective tissues include your bones, your cartilages, your fats, your blood, and a whole host of other tissues. You would expect to find blank fibers in areas that undergo a lot of stretch and rebound. Would that be elastic, collagen, reticular, or white? Did you say elastic? If you did, that's correct. I like to think about the elastic on a pair of shorts or on a pair of underwear. You can stretch the waistband on a pair of shorts, for example, and then if you let it go, it snaps back into its original shape. The same is true for tissues that have elastic fibers in them. They stretch and then snap back into shape. One of the best examples of this is the aorta. The aorta is a large blood vessel that comes off of the heart. Every time the heart contracts to squeeze blood out, the aorta has to stretch to accommodate blood flow and then recoil to get its shape back. This helps pump the blood from the heart further to the rest of the body. Of the following cell types, which are found patrolling areas exposed to harmful bacteria? Do you think that's fibroblasts, osteocytes, macrophages, or chondroblasts? Macrophages and neutrophils are the bacteria slayers. They patrol areas exposed to harmful bacteria and then phagocytize those cells to protect the body from infection. If you need to take a break, now would be a good time to do that. If not, let's talk about the specialized connective tissues. Your specialized connective tissues have more specific functions than the general connective tissues or the connective tissue proper that we've already talked about. There are three main types of specialized connective tissues. First are your cartilages. Cartilages are found in your joints between your bones. It's found in your ear, in your nose, and in segments of the respiratory tract. Bone tissue, also called osseous tissue, helps to support the body and protect your vital organs. In addition to those two functions, it also provides attachment points for muscles that allow for movement, and it's a storehouse for calcium, phosphorus, and other minerals. Bone tissue is also involved in blood cell production because it houses your bone marrow. And then finally, your bone tissue also stores fat. Your third type of specialized connective tissue is blood. Blood is the only liquid tissue in the body. It has a liquid ECM called plasma, and plasma consists mostly of water, dissolved solutes, and proteins and hormones. Suspended within plasma, you have different types of blood cells like red blood cells called erythrocytes and white blood cells, which are called leukocytes. There are also cell fragments called platelets within this ECM. Your cartilages are tough, flexible tissues. Their main function is to absorb shock and resist pulling and pressing and tearing forces. Your ECM for cartilage consists of collagen and elastic fibers. You also have ground substance, so there's glycosaminoglycans and proteoglycans. There are two main cell types that we'll find in cartilage. The first cell type is called a chondroblast. Anytime you see the prefix chondro like this, you should think cartilage. These are immature cells that divide by mitosis and make most of the extracellular matrix for your cartilage. Eventually, as these cells secrete extracellular matrix, they become surrounded by it, and they'll be enclosed in small cavities called lacunae. Once these cells are surrounded by ECM, they begin to mature and become largely inactive chondrocytes. So the two main cell types are chondroblasts, which make most of the ECM, and chondrocytes, which are largely inactive but may maintain the ECM that surrounds them. Cartilages are essentially avascular. This means that there are no blood vessels within the cartilage itself. Rather, their blood supply is limited to a connective tissue covering or sheath that surrounds the cartilage. This sheath is called the perichondrium. Peri is a prefix meaning around, and here's that chondro root. Again, chondro means cartilage, so this is a sheath that goes around the cartilage. The perichondrium is composed of dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue. Do you remember that tissue? It's the one with the thick collagen bundles arranged in several different directions to provide resistance to stretching in multiple planes. The practical implication of cartilage being avascular is that oxygen and nutrients must diffuse from the perichondrium through the extracellular matrix of the cartilage to feed the chondroblasts and chondrocytes within that tissue. This limits the thickness of living cartilages, and it slows healing when cartilages are damaged. If you have a friend or a relative with a cartilage piercing in their ear, you know that it takes 6 months to a year or more for that to completely heal. This is far longer than it takes for most other damage in the body to heal. There are 3 classes of cartilages based on their ECM composition. You have hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the most abundant cartilage in the body. The extracellular matrix is mostly ground substance with small bundles of fine collagen fibers. The tissue has a kind of glossy bluish-gray appearance. You'll find this tissue on the ends of bones and joints where it's called articular cartilage. You'll also find it linking the sternum to the ribs and framing sections of the respiratory tract, and you'll find it in the nose as well. Most of the fetal skeleton is hyaline cartilage, but it gets replaced with bone during development. This figure of hyaline cartilage shows you chondrocytes enclosed in a hole called a lacuna. Surrounding the lacuna is the ECM of this cartilage. And if you look really closely, you might see some smears going around the lacunae. Those would be the fine collagen fibers in this ECM. This is fibrocartilage. You'll know this tissue when you see it because it's filled with bundles of collagen fibers and there's little room for ground substance in the ECM. Look at this image. You don't see the vast fields of white that you saw with the loose or areolar tissue. This ECM is chock full of stained strands like these. Those are the collagen and elastic fibers. Fibroblasts reside in this tissue in addition to chondroblasts and chondrocytes. So in this figure you can see the chondrocytes here inside of their little spaces. These spaces again are called lacunae. The job of the fibroblasts, along with the chondroblasts and chondrocytes, is to fill the ECM with collagen and some elastic fibers. The presence of collagen makes this tissue resistant to excessive stretching. It provides tensile strength. The presence of elastic fibers, however, gives some some elasticity to the tissue as well. You'll find fibrocartilage in between the bones of your fibrous joints. So for example, think about the pubic symphysis. There's a strip of fibrocartilage between the pelvic bones anteriorly. You'll also find this cartilage forming the articular discs that improve the fit of bones within your joints. So you can think of, for example, the meniscus, a thick cartilage disc that improves the fit between the femur and the tibia in your knee. Elastic cartilage is the last of your cartilages. you're going to find mostly elastic fibers in the ECM. So these darkly stained strands that you see here, those are the elastic fibers. The presence of the elastic fibers allows this tissue to vibrate, and we're going to find it in a limited number of structures in the human body. One structure where we'll find elastic cartilage is in the external ear. Here, the cartilages vibrate and assist with the detection of sound in the air. In the larynx, that's your voice box, the presence of elastic cartilage assists with the production of sound. Bone is another specialized connective tissue. It has the distinction of having a solid extracellular matrix. The extracellular matrix of bone is composed about 35% of organic components, such as collagen fibers and ground substance. Together, collagen fibers and ground substance are called osteoid. The remaining 65% of the ECM is composed of inorganic calcium phosphate crystals called hydroxyapatite. This is the formula for hydroxyapatite. I don't expect you to remember this formula, but I would hope that you'd remember that hydroxyapatite is composed of calcium and phosphate. Now, when we look at a bone, it looks like it is a pretty static and stable structure. But in actuality, bone is a very dynamic tissue. It is remodeled, or its shape is changed based upon the stresses or the lack of stress that's placed on it. Pulling, or tension, increases the activity of special cells that we find on the surface of bones. These are called osteoblasts, and osteoblasts build bone through a process called bone deposition. Pressing forces, or compression, increases the activity of a different type of bone cell called an osteoclast. Osteoclasts break down bones, and then the components are reabsorbed by the body and recycled. There's a third type of cell that we find in bone, and they would be found here. These would be osteocytes. So as osteoblasts make ECM and build bone, eventually they become surrounded by that ECM. This causes your osteoblasts, which are immature cells, to change and become mature cells called osteocytes. Osteocytes maintain the bone ECM. They are found inside of little holes called lacunae. Lacunae are joined to each other via small channels. In this picture, they look a little bit like cracks in the bone. These are called canaliculi, and they allow osteocytes to communicate with each other and to communicate with osteoblasts as well. You'll find the lacunae containing osteocytes on the periphery of rims or layers of bone, like this one, called lamellae. The last specialized connective tissue that we want to consider for this video is blood. As I mentioned earlier, blood has the unique distinction of being a liquid tissue. Its extracellular matrix is fluid, and it's called blood plasma. The proteins in blood plasma are called plasma proteins, and they are not fibers like in your other connective tissues. These plasma proteins are smaller and generally rounder. They'll have a variety of functions, including the transport of substances and blood clotting. There are three types of cellular forms inside of blood plasma. These would be the erythrocytes, or red blood cells, Their main function is to transport oxygen throughout the body, and they are these red donut-looking cells in the figure that you see here. The second type of cell is called a leukocyte, or a white blood cell. These function in immunity, and you'll know these cells when you see them because they usually have nuclei that are stained purple, like these guys. Finally, you'll find little cell particles like these. They are called platelets, and they function in blood clotting. These are not cells, but rather they are cell fragments. So let's try a few questions. Of the four main classes of connective tissue, which has the least solid ground substance? Would that be connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone tissue, or blood? Blood, that's right. Blood has a liquid ECM, unlike all of your other connective tissues. Of the following connective tissues, which generally takes the most time to recover from an injury? Would that be bone, cartilage, areolar connective tissue, or adipose tissue? That's right, it's cartilage. Remember, the reason for the slow healing time of cartilage is that cartilages are surrounded by a perichondrium, and that's where the blood supply for the cartilage is located. Nutrients and oxygen have to diffuse from the blood vessels into the cartilage, and it has to diffuse through the ECM before it gets to the cells like the chondroblasts and the chondrocytes, which are responsible for making ECM. Why is blood classified as a connective tissue? Is it because blood connects two areas of the body, or blood provides mechanical supportive organs, or blood stores a large quantity of lipids, or is it that blood develops from mesenchyme? Blood develops from mesenchyme. So one thing that we didn't really talk about in this video is that all of your connective tissues develop from a fetal tissue called mesenchyme. Here's one last question. Which of the following types of cartilage is slightly compressible but resists tension well? Would that be hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage, or articular cartilage? I hope you said fibrocartilage. Remember, fibrocartilage has lots of collagen fibers and sometimes a few elastic fibers. Together, you get resistance to compression and tension. Whew, so this was a bit of a long video, but I hope it's been helpful in getting you acquainted with the connective tissues. In the beginning of the video, we said that connective tissues function to connect and bind tissues and organs in the human body. We said they support body structures. They protect either through the presence of immune system cells or by forming cages around softer tissues and structures. And we said that they transport substances. The functions of connective tissues are directly related to the structures of the tissue. Remember that we classify connective tissues by the cells in the tissue as well as the composition of the ECM. Clues to function can be gathered by looking at how many and what types of protein fibers are in that tissue. If you see lots of collagen fibers or collagen fiber bundles, then you know that that tissue is going to be in an area that either receives a lot of pulling or a lot of compression. If you see lots of elastic fibers, then you know that that tissue belongs in an area of the body where there's either lots of vibration or lots of stretching and recoil. If you see reticular fibers, then you know that that tissue probably belongs to either a lymph node or the spleen, or you're looking at the inside of an organ where the reticular fibers are forming a network, an internal skeleton, if you will. So, this wraps up connective tissues. In the next video, we'll look at muscles and nervous tissue. I'll see you then.